Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Columbus JavaScript user group, or as we're trying to call it now, ColumbusJS. I've been saying Columbus JavaScript user group for damn near a decade now, and so it's pretty ingrained. But welcome to ColumbusJS. We've got a good talk for you tonight. We got Justin James coming to you live and direct from Phoenix, Arizona. He's wearing his Cypress.io shirt, and I'm going to give you a hint. That's what he's talking about. Before Justin kicks off his talk, just some, how does this work questions. If you're here on Zoom, then if you've got a question, just, give it a pause, wait for a pause in Justin and just ask, or hold them to the end, or you can even do that little thing where you can, raise your hand. That's applause, I guess, but raise your hand, indicate somehow that you want to speak. And you can also put your questions in chat, and I will be keeping an eye on the questions in chat as well, so that if I can interject them as well. So if you got questions on Zoom, that's what we'll do. If you're watching on Twitch, I'll be watching Twitch chat as well. So go ahead and drop your question in there, and I'll make sure that Justin hears it. And I don't think Justin's monitoring the ColumbusJS Twitch. Probably not. He wants to conserve bandwidth, I'm sure. So, but yeah, that's what we got going on. So any questions before we get started? No questions is great. So it's all yours, Justin.
Thank you, Guy. I appreciate that. And thank you again for having me out to the ColumbusJS. I love talking about Cypress, as you can tell, since I happen to have a Cypress shirt on. I will preface this talk with, I do not work for Cypress at all. I always get asked that question when I give these talks. Do I actually work for them? I do not work for them. I don't truly have any influence over what they do. I just happen to love their product. So let me share out my screen here, and we'll go through some slides. We'll go through some training material. We'll go through some demos. I'll show some code off, show some really cool things that you can actually do in the Cypress space. And as Guy mentioned, if you have questions on the way, feel free, if you're on the Zoom, unmute yourself, ask the question, throw it into the Zoom chat. If you don't want to unmute yourself, if you're on Twitch, put it in the Twitch chat, and we will get your questions answered. I love doing questions and having that interaction. I don't want to be up here pontificating for the next hour with no interaction. So feel free, any questions you have. Nothing's really off limits related to Cypress. So let me share out here, and we will kick this off. Can you see the slides that I am sharing? Cool, I got a thumbs up. So we're gonna talk about Cypress and where automated UI testing isn't just for QA. One of the big pieces that I always hear is testing really is for QA. And I'm here to tell you as a developer, it doesn't have to be the case. And you'll see why here coming up. First, we're gonna start off with a little bit of avatar description. All of us have kind of been in this space, and hence in a land that's not all too familiar to us, many of us have QA teams or somebody on your team that really focuses on testing more than anything. We're going to call him Bob in this case. Then we have our development team. We've got Kat doing development work. Really cares about all the coding, and that's the primary focus typically on the developer side. Obviously, every team has, whether it's a manager, whether it's a product owner, if you're in the Scrum team, has somebody that's in charge of interacting with all the customers. And then we have our client. So every team pretty much has this makeup of stuff, and they all have responsibilities and wants. If we think about what is Bob's goal, or actually what's Jill's goal, we'll start with Jill. Jill is the manager, wants happy paying customers. That's what management's looking for. That's their primary focus. They don't necessarily care how we get to happy paying customers though. They just want the happy paying customers because they don't want to have those discussions that go, you know what, we had another release that went bad and we're really unhappy with you and we're thinking about going somewhere else. Like, no manager wants that. So Jill's goal is to have that. Now, Bob and Kat both have the same goals, but they typically achieve them in different ways. They both want to produce high quality software that makes a difference in the world. That is really why all of us became software developers. All of us are in the software industry because we do want to make a difference in people's lives. And we all want to produce high quality software. I've never ran across, in 20 plus years of doing this, never ran into someone that went, I just want to throw something out there and I don't really care if it works or not. And I just want to create crappy software. Like, none of us want to do that. We all want high quality software, and we want to do it as fast as we can, and we want to make a difference doing it. And then what does our client ultimately want? They want to make money. And their goal is that we don't cost them money. We don't put defects out into their products that ultimately cost them money. Now, we all know there is no such thing as a 100% defect-free product. We're creating stuff. There's going to be defects in them. The goal is to really catch them before they hit production, before they actually make it out into the end user's hands that cause issues, and to minimize the critical defects. Because there may be things that still slip through the cracks. No matter how much you test, there's still things that slip through the cracks, but we want to minimize that, but we don't cost our client money. So let's talk a bit about waterfall and agile here and how testing typically happens. Because most teams I talk to go, yeah, testing's just a fallacy on our team. We talk about it, but we never really automate it. We never really do anything with it. And a lot of that comes from the software development methodologies. If we look at like the waterfall methodology, the stuff that's at the top is the fixed. Our features are always fixed. We get this big requirements document, and we're going to deliver a requirements document no matter what. And so what ends up happening in that middle is with that quality, it's partially fixed, but it's also partially variable. What's the very first thing that goes in a waterfall process when you start getting behind schedule? We start cutting out the testing time every single time. You go, you know what? That 3 weeks that we have at the end of our project where we're going to do this gigantic testing, make sure everything's good. Yeah, we're behind, so we're going to cut that down to 2 weeks, then a week. Then you know what? We're just going to do that in a day. That's typically how a lot of the waterfall process works. And then the stuff that really is variable at the bottom is the time, is the cost. We see a lot of times that we can inflate the cost up because you just keep going and going and going. I've seen projects take millions of dollars that probably shouldn't have. The government's notorious for that with a lot of their software projects that just go on 3-4 times longer than they should have because it's very variable. It's not a fixed thing. Same thing with the time. Maybe we say it's going to take 6 months, but we get into it, we go 9 months, 10 months. But ultimately, we don't have the quality focus a lot of times in waterfall. But if we think in the agile space, which is where a lot of software teams have gone these days, the stuff that becomes fixed is our cost is fixed, our time is fixed, and our quality is actually fixed. So no matter what happens, we have a finite amount of time. Every 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, however long your sprints are, that's our time. The cost is going to be who's ever on your team, whatever software we currently have, that typically is not going to change. Whatever you bid on the project typically isn't going to change. Quality isn't going to change either. You're going to automate the software or the quality testing. You're going to automate all of that QA work. And if you can't, you're going to have a team that's going to manually be doing all of that work. The thing that now becomes variable is our features. We start getting behind, we start pulling features out. We start reducing our scope down so that we can still hit the time frame that we needed, hit it on budget, and we can still have the same quality, which leads us really into all the testing stuff that we're talking about today so we can ultimately automate all of that quality. And from a testing pyramid, if you've ever attended a testing talk, you always see this pyramid where we talk about the top of the pyramid is end-to-end testing. That's where you hook everything up. Your UI talks to your API, that talks to your database, talks to any third-party systems that you need to interface with. Nothing's actually mocked out. It's all real systems. Typically, we focus on about 10% of that because it's really expensive to do all that work. It's really slow typically to do that. If you're in systems that have a queuing mechanism, you have to wait for the queue to hit. It takes a while. And you also need all of that hardware, whether it's virtual machines, whether it's Docker containers, whether it's physical machines. It takes a while to spin all that up. Then the next thing in our pyramid is our integration test. This is where we mock out some of the stuff. Maybe your UI talks to your API that talks to the database, but now you're mocking out all of your third-party integrations so that you don't have to worry about that extra spin-up time. But where most of us spend our time traditionally in software development when we talk about automation and the QA stuff is in unit testing. About 70% of the time is always in the unit testing space because they're the quickest to run. They're the lowest cost to actually create. This is our traditional pyramid. This isn't our UI pyramid though. So we kind of crumple this up and toss this out in the UI space. And really we start at the integration space when we look at the UI. We mock out all of our API integrations because we need to worry about UI behaviors. If I click the button and it's supposed to pop up a dialog, did it pop up the right dialog, have the right things enabled? If I'm scrubbing a text box for certain inputs not to be there, as I'm typing, is it actually scrubbing out the things that shouldn't be there? Is all the validation working for forms? All that stuff becomes integration test where I don't need to call the API to do that test. I just need data in there to make the UI have the behaviors. So we spend a lot more time in our integration space. Then we bump up our end-to-end where we're actually talking from our UI to our API, right, to the database. We put that up at the 20% mark because we want to make sure all the stuff is working. So a great example is like a login. I only need to test my login once. If I've gone through the full path and my login works once, my logout works, my sign up process works, I don't need to go through that process again for every single test that I need to run. I can mock out that in the integration space to go, I've already logged in, here's all the mocking for it. But in the end-to-end, I at least test all of my critical paths at least one time. Then our last piece in the UI space is our unit test. There is times it makes sense to still unit test, but it's a lot less. The place I'm in the Angular space. So in that space, the stuff I really spend time doing unit test is more stuff like pipes, more pure JavaScript and TypeScript functions that don't actually need the Angular framework around it. Anything that needs the Angular framework around it, by the time I spin everything up, I could have just done the actual integration test through Cypress and actually see what's happening in the UI. So I have a lot less unit testing. And for people that have seen me before, or a couple of years ago, I used to actually do a whole presentation about unit testing in the Angular space. And then Cypress came along and I've totally switched my stance going from almost all unit testing to almost all Cypress because it made a lot more sense. It caught a lot more of the issues we were having, which really were about behavior. We weren't having a ton of logic issues. We were having a ton of UI behaviors. The dialog didn't pop up right, or the button should have been enabled and wasn't enabled. And when you run unit tests, you don't get to see a UI for that, and it's really hard to troubleshoot. So we're going to look at some of that stuff in the Cypress space. But before we get there, I just want to let you know, who the heck am I? So I'm actually a developer who loves testing thanks to Cypress. I do not come from a QA background. I don't come from that testing background. I truly am a developer that for years has gone, I don't really want to do this UI testing because it was always tough. It was always flaky. The stuff that was available to us for the last 15 years has really been hard to use. When I talk to a lot of developers that are in that testing space, they go, you know what, we've done it all, but we've got a 40% flake rate that literally we click the run button again and stuff just magically passes the second time. I don't have that problem with Cypress, hence why I love it as a developer. It actually made my job way easier as a developer. Way less defects are actually coming back to me. And I am a Cypress community ambassador. That program is all about people like me that go out into the community and talk about Cypress, and it's their way to reward. Very similar to like a Microsoft MVP, a Google developer, or Google's version of MVP. They're totally escaping what the Google version is called. That's what their community ambassador program's about. I also own a company called Let Your Nerd Be Heard, where I work with entrepreneurs, speakers, authors, coaches to build their authority, influence, and income using YouTube. I host my own podcast, Let Your Nerd Be Heard podcast. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. But enough about me. Let's talk about what is Cypress? What exactly is this thing that I'm hinting around about? In plain and simple, it is our next generation web UI testing tool. It is that tool that enables you to quickly test your code and to have that consistent output so that you don't have to manually go through and do all of your testing. One of the huge things in here, it's not constrained by Selenium. Most of the UI testing tools you run across have Selenium behind the scenes. That means you've got some slowness going on in there, which makes it a little bit tough to actually get stuff working in a good speed. It's got some flakiness. So speed's a huge, huge thing in the Cypress world. Everything that they focus on is, how do I get my test to run faster? How do I get it so that it just works as fast as possible? How do I make it so it's flake resistant? One of the big pieces I mentioned earlier with Selenium is those people that consistently tell me, we've automated everything in Selenium and we have that 40% failure rate where we literally hit the run button and it just magically passes because the machine got faster the second time and maybe had some magic slowdown and they didn't put a long enough wait time in there. A lot of stuff in the Selenium space has wait times. You click on a button and you have to tell it, wait for 5 seconds while it goes off and makes an API call. And you hope that that 5 seconds was plenty of time in order for that API call to actually happen to come back. Cypress takes a different approach. Because it runs in the same space as the browser, you can actually intercept those API calls. So you can tell it, wait for that API call to actually finish. Wait for that animation to finish. So no longer do I put stuff like wait 5 seconds in there. I tell it, wait for this API call to actually finish running. And once it sees that, then it just goes on. So that got rid of a lot of that flakiness. Because it also runs in the same browser space, it's able to intercept tons of stuff that other products like Selenium aren't able to actually intercept. It knows all the different events that happen in the browser, knows all the different animations that can happen, all the different API calls. You can intercept all of that stuff. It's super debuggable as well. We'll see when I show the Cypress UI, you can actually look at every single step that it was running in your test. What did the UI look like at that point in time? You can look at all the API calls it's making, see what is the response, what is the stuff that you passed into it, easily be able to debug all of that stuff. So let's take a quick gander through what does Cypress actually look like. And I have a little demo app. It's a little to-do app that I'm going to actually share out here. So when I run Angular workshops, this is the app we build, which is nothing more than a mini to-do app. So we've got login here. I've got to create an account page. We obviously have some validation actually built into this. I can actually type the right username and password. You can see I've got some validation here. It's got to be 6 characters. I can log in. I can create that account. I've got a bunch of menu items as well here that we can test. Once I'm logged in, and it'll take a sec to actually log in since I have not spun up the API fully. Once it logs in, then I'll actually be able to see to-do app or to-do line items where I can check them off. I can delete them. Then I can toggle whether they were completed, not completed. I can add in new items. So just waiting for my Heroku API to actually spin up here. There we go. So you can see this list of things where I can toggle them off. I can say deleted. It pops up a, are you sure you want to delete? I can cancel it. I can click OK. Little validation here and here. So this app, even though I've written it, if I went through and truly tested everything and made sure all the messages looked the way they were supposed to look, made sure all the links worked the way they should, everything was in the right spot here, it's going to take me a good 15, 20 minutes, even for this simple application to go through. Instead, if I pull up the Cypress UI, I can go through here. Let's kick this off again. Because we're on Zoom, it's going to potentially lag a little bit here, but what you can see is on the left side is all my tests. On the middle of the screen here is what it's actually doing. So it's stepping through all of those pieces that I would normally do. Do I have a valid email? Do I not have a valid email? Do I have the right password length? If I log in, does it redirect me to the home page? If I click the create account button, does it take me to the sign up page? And if I go through that process, does it create a new account that then logs me into the home page? Does my name actually show up in the banner once I'm logged in? Does all of my menu items go to the right place? Can I actually log out of the system? Can I add all the to-do items in here? And we'll see when this is done running. We're going to be somewhere in about the 60-second range for it to run probably 50 to 60 tests. So we'll let this finish here. So 49 tests took 53 seconds to run all of this. So if I start stepping through some of these, you can see here that for this minimum length validation, it runs a couple APIs that I've mocked out. So it's going to wait for those. I'm going to come visit the home page. It's going to get my account info. It's going to get my to-do list here. And then it's going to make sure I'm on the right page. You can see the middle section starts changing as I click on each of these steps. So this orange-ish, yellow-ish, kind of grayish box, it highlights it as I click on the get. So you can see what exactly is the element I'm playing with. You see, as I start typing in, I get this little red dot over the actual element. That tells me it's actually going to type into that element. So I can start stepping through all the code here and see what is the actual, or stepping through the test, what is the actual thing that's happening in the test. Now for these tests, because they all passed, not super important to actually be able to step through them. But if this test case had actually failed, having this ability to step through every one of the steps is immensely valuable. Makes it way easier than like a unit test where you literally don't get a UI at all. You just get an error message that says, this element wasn't visible. This element wasn't able to be typed into. And you're like, well, what the heck did the UI look like at that point? Some of the times you realize, oh, we forgot to enable something to turn on in that scenario. Or like at work, we use Angular Material a ton. Angular Material is notorious for putting an invisible div across the whole page when it pops up some of its drop down, some of its menus. And if you don't actually be able to step through this, you would never know that that div even actually exists because it's invisible. We didn't know it existed until we started doing testing and going, why can't I click on the button after I pick my drop down item? It was like, oh, because that div hadn't gone away. So you start to be able to see those kinds of things. You start to be able to see, where did things actually fail in here? If I open up the dev tools, because it is Chrome after all, so I can open up my dev tools. If I scroll back up here and click on one of these wait items, I can actually, and I'll zoom in a little, sure that's a little small. I can actually see what was the API call that got made, what was my request body, what was my response. So I can dig into all kinds of details. There's a slew of details that actually show up in a lot of these places. So if I go pick the get command, you can see what did it yield? It yielded this whole object, so I can see what did it actually find in there? How many of the elements did it actually find? What was the selector that I used? So all of this is built into Cypress for us. I didn't have to program any of this debuggability. It came out of the box to me. Before I jump into how do we get started with installing all this, any questions on the functionality that I've showed? I'm not seeing any questions. Guys,
I want to see how to do it. I want to see how to do it.
I know you do. So let's see, how do we, first thing we gotta do is actually we're gonna look at, before we actually get an install, what can it do and how does it kind of work? So it can do lots of things I've talked about. It can get elements on a page. You can mock out an API call. You can wait for that API call, click on elements, look at locations and URLs and type into an input field. You can clear your input fields. You can check the array lengths of stuff. So it's great for like a grid. So a lot of times we have grids on our pages. We want to make sure if we give it 6 records, did 6 rows actually show up in the grid? And so I don't have to look at each of the individual. I can just say, go select me that Angular Material row and check, did it have 6 items or not? I can also look at positional elements. I can look at those first rows if it returns multiple things. I can look at, is my link set up right? We do a lot of verifying sorting in our grids. Because we have sortable grids. You click on the column, it sorts it async. You click on it again, it sorts it desync or descending. I can actually verify that that stuff happened by looking at the first row. Now it should be the last row and vice versa. I can do elements visible, invisible, enabled, disabled. We're gonna actually look at how do you actually set all of that stuff up, because it's way easier than it actually sounds.
I have a question
Go
just
for it.
on, is it possible to mock out a source element or say from an image element or another kind of media element that's say, loaded on the page in your app? So let's say you don't have access to that server, so it would just 404, and so you get lots of 404 warnings if you're using, say, an Angular unit tests.
Potentially, I would have to see the code to see what the mock looks like. If it's doing like an XHR or API call, absolutely you can mock all of those pieces out. But which potentially that's how you might be getting the images. If it's going to a true URL, you'd have to potentially play around with how do you actually get that working.
It'd be like in the DOM element itself or the DOM API.
Yeah. Typically, we don't mock out DOM elements because they show up on the page. And so you'd have to figure out how do you get those elements there initially. And I'd have to actually see some of that code to see exactly what that one looked like. I'm sure there is probably a way to work around it. Let's take a look at how do you enable all this stuff. First thing to know, everything is based off the CY object. So everything you're going to see in the Cypress space is cy.something. So I mentioned you can visit the URL. This is the very first thing you're going to do in pretty much all of your test cases after you go through your setup methods. You have to visit an actual web page in order to actually test the web page. So cy.visit, you give it your actual page. You'll notice it doesn't have the full URL in there. We'll cover how you configure that coming up so that you don't have to go localhost :4200/unknown all over the place. You can actually set that up in some config stuff. If I want to test, make sure I'm on the right page, I can say, go look at the path name, and then it should equal /unknown. This is great when you're doing login stuff. Like if I go to the home page and I'm not logged in, it's probably going to redirect me somewhere, or it should redirect me someplace. Well, if it does redirect me and I'm not intending that, I want to make sure that I truly ended up on the actual page. So this is a great way to actually test that. No sense in trying to run through test cases if you got redirected somewhere else and you're not even on the page, because obviously everything's going to fail and you're going to wonder why. And you're going to come back and go, oh, I got redirected for some odd reason. If I want to get an element, cy.get. I can give it pretty much every jQuery selector you can think of works. I can give it classes. So .addBTN here as an actual class. And then I can say it should do something. It should contain a word. It should be visible. It should be invisible. Whatever I need to do that, I should be able to click it. What should be coming up here? The one thing that this slide particular is not best practice for the get command. Because what is the one thing that every UI developer is responsible for? Look and feel of their application, which in turn means they tend to change classes. They update a class name, they remove a class name and put something else in there. That's their job. And last thing you want to do is have all of your tests fail just because you updated a class name. So the better way to do it is with an actual attribute you add onto your elements. The recommended one from Cypress is data-cy. And so all of our elements in our app that we want to test, we add a data-cy equals and whatever we want the name to be. So in this case, add btn, and that's never going to change, or at least typically it doesn't change. And no matter what the UI developer is actually doing, you're not going to change this actual attribute, this element, or the attribute on the element. And so you can actually get your testing continue to run over and over. And then you just do the same stuff that you would do on it. And you'll see that here. If I want to click on the element, I still do the same get that actually gets me one of the elements. One thing not to do from a best practice, because every one of us has done this or will try to do this, we'll say, I need to get access to this element multiple times, so let me put it in a variable, and I'll just reference the variable. You will get some of the flakiest behavior because it won't return back what you actually think it will return back. Like, if you wanted to do that method, the better way to do it is either to chain if you can. A lot of these commands you can change. So I could say cy.get, .type, .click. I can chain them all together. Or I can actually put my data-cy text into a variable and reference that. So if I ever needed to change the element, then I can just change that one variable for the attribute name. But don't store cy.get's response in a variable. You will get some of the flakiest behavior and wonder why your tests are breaking. So on this one, if you need to click on an element, .click, you'll start to see their API is really, really obvious. If you think what it's supposed to do, probably is what the name of it actually is. Kind of like you want to type into an input field, it's going to be .type. So I get my element, I say .type, give whatever text I want to type in. This will type one character at a time into there. And it's got a little bit of a delay, about 100 millisecond delay as it types, to fairly well simulate what a user is actually doing. Because very rarely can a user type all of that in a microsecond. Like, it takes a little bit of time to actually type out the words. You can also do something like put special things in there, like tabs, key returns, enter. So the little squiggly bracket, enter, and my squiggly bracket, that'll actually type to do test item and then hit the enter key for me. So in many cases, that'll submit your form. So you want to replicate that same behavior that a user is having. You could do the same thing if you wanted to tab through all of your fields to make sure if the tab order was an important thing for you, making sure you got the right tab order on there. Just do this, replace enter with tab, and it would go to the next field. You can also clear an input field with, as you would expect, .clear. And this is a really useful test to make sure your validation comes back up. If I type something in there, I pass the validation. If I clear the field out, does the validation actually come back? Sounds really obvious, but that is actually one of the tests that my QA always runs. And every so often, they'll find a spot where we accidentally put in there. If I have more than one item in there, then go ahead and run the validation. Or it's like, oops, it should have been if I don't have anything in there, run the validation. So just one more place to check. You're trying to automate and do everything that you think the customer and the user is going to actually potentially do. Checking lengths of elements should have .length, and you give it the number of elements you expect it to have. Number of rows, number of to-do items in there. And if it passes, great. If not, it's going to throw the error for you. You can also get things by position. So I mentioned doing the sorting test where I need to get the first row and I need to get the last row. I can say :first row on my actual attribute for the data CY, or in my selector, I can say .eq and I can give it the name. So I can get any order that's in here. Obviously, if I exceed the number of records, it's going to error. But this one would get the first. I could put 2, 3, 4, whatever I need to put in here. I can also, in the very first line, if I want to get the last item, I can say :last. So they have first, they have last, are built in. Everything else is .eq. Verifying our links. So I can get my link. I can say has ATTR, so short for attribute. Look at the href, and it should include /unknown in its URL. In a lot of cases for this particular test, I didn't really care what else got passed it in on there. As long as it included /unknown, my system said, we're good to go. Element visible should be .visible, and the inverse of it should not be .visible. So pretty obvious one. Enable is a little not obvious. So in order to make sure it's enabled, it's not .b .disabled. And to make sure it's disabled, it's b .disabled. So these are the common things that you are going to do in Cypress over and over. About 80% of my tests have some combination of all the stuff that I just showed in here. And then we get into mocking our actual API calls. So we start with the CY server, and then we have to tell it what is the route we want to actually mock. What's the URL? What's the status code? What kind of method do I want it to be? Get, post, put, delete, all our standard REST CRUD operators. What is the response that I expect? Do I expect an array? Do I expect an object? Do I expect text? Do I expect something else? Whatever the response needs to be, the easiest way to get these responses, open up the dev tools, make your actual calls with your UI, and grab that JSON response. Because there's nothing like trying to actually write out one of those by hand. We've got some really, really in-depth JSON responses that I probably would spend 30 minutes just trying to type out this silly thing, or I grab it off the Chrome DevTools. And then
So
the last,
Doug has an
yeah, it's
interesting
not Doug's.
question. Okay, yeah.
I will get to that in a moment. Let me finish off these next couple of slides and I'll come up to that question. So the last piece here, so we've positioned all of this stuff and mocked out our route. We need to give the .as. This is a way we can actually refer to it. So anytime I needed to actually wait for this identity, I could say .as, give the identity. And now when I need to wait, I do a cy.wait. And then in the string, I say at, and whatever that as name was. So at identity, and that will stop my testing and it will wait for that API call to finish. By default, it has a timeout, I believe, of 5 seconds. So if you're, and you can always extend that. One of the parameters you can put in the wait is how long to actually wait for that call to finish. But it will stop at that point, and once it sees it, then it will go on. If you start thinking, and I see this all the time as people get started with Cypress, you go, you know what, something's flaky, and I notice if I just wait a little bit longer, it happens to work, so I'm just going to say cy wait and give it a time. That is an anti-pattern and a code smell. If you start doing that and your test magically pass, there's something that in your coding that is missing. Whether you're doing a debounce time where you told it to type something and then wait X number of milliseconds or seconds before it went and made an API call and you didn't account for that. And so you put a wait time in there and that you magically pass over that. If that's the case, there's a CY clock. So you can actually forward your time to say, forward past that debounce time so that it triggers the API call. So always when you start to get into wait times, there's something that is missing in your code. But normally it's your testing code. It's normally not your actual code. You forgot to mock something out. You forgot to tell it to forward time so that you can get past your set timeouts and your debounce time. It's in here. So anti-pattern for actually waiting for an actual specific time. This one is how you would wait for the actual API calls. So before we get into install and configure, let's take a look at Doug's question here. He said, can you check if the page is scrolled to show an element? I've actually never tried to scroll in a test to particularly show an element. So I would actually have to play with it. I am sure there's got to be a way to scroll down to a page, but because they have the whole DOM, if I just literally need to say, is the element visible? I can use the stuff that I showed. If you're scrolling down the page and the intent is as I scroll, something else shows up. Like you see that a lot with like the Facebook feeds or the Twitter feeds, as you scroll down, they pull in more records. So they don't try to pull all those things in at once. I can almost guarantee, because it's such a common functionality, a quick Cypress search in their docs, they probably have a recipe to actually do that kind of testing because it is such a common scenario. And if they don't have it, the Cypress team is really, really responsive. So we can actually hit them up and ask, how do you do this? I saw another question come in just now. Do you need multiple CY server calls to do multiple API origins, or use the URL as an absolute URL on the mock? So Matthew, feel free to unmute yourself and explain multiple origin, meaning.
Sorry, I was trying to
URLs.
type fast. Yeah, let's say you have a API calls to different servers to do different things. So you have, for whatever reason, 2 different APIs, and you just need to mock out in 2 different CY server calls, or can you just do one CY server and then I can't remember I think it was .get or whatever.
Yeah, the CY route. Yep. So perfect. That is a great question, actually. So CY server is just the trigger for Cypress to actually start monitoring the routes. So you only need to truly set it up once per test, whether you stick it into the before each test or you stick it into each individual test. It does reset your mocks in between tests because obviously it wants to reset those as it should. You want to start with a clean state for each test. But for each place in different URL, you just do a CY route. And that was what you get. Let me just scroll back a couple slides because it's not too far back. So if I had another route, say I wanted to do /to-do. So I say CY server, put the route I have here for identity, do another CY.route to say /to-do, and fill out all the parameters that need to be there. You can
that URL property can be an absolute URL to a different domain that you're marking. Okay.
Absolutely. I could type in google.com/to-do, or I could leave it here where it's going to resolve back to ultimately, when we get to the configs, it'd be localhost 4200. Yep, you can have both absolute or relative. Any other questions we have before we talk about how do you install and configure this? So how do we install? It is an npm package. So npm --save-dev Cypress. There's a couple installs that are ultimately going to happen. The first time it brings down the Cypress UI for you in the framework. It will install everything it needs in order to launch the UI up for you in order to do all of that work. It does take a little bit the very first time you install Cypress because it has to bring down basically the Chromium package that it is using. Luckily enough, it caches it. So once you have it down, no matter how many projects you have, as long as that version is there, it caches it and will pull from cache. And the nice part is it caches by version for you. So you don't have to worry about, oh, I got to upgrade all my projects at once. Nope, it'll use whatever version that you actually have in there. Configuration wise, you can set what is the viewport height and width that you want it. It has a default one in there, and I want to say it's somewhere in the 1200, probably 1280 range right now. It used to be 1000 by 600. You can set it to whatever viewport that you want, either at this level, which is in the Cypress JSON file that you're going to have to put at the root of your project. Cypress will look for this file, do any configurations. Specifically for the viewport width and height, you can also set them per test or per set of tests. So if you want to do like mobile testing, the very top of your test, in your before all, you say, set my viewport height and width to whatever width you wanted for, say, like an iPhone, for whatever Android, whatever the mobile size that you wanted was. And then outside of that test, it will default back to whatever's in this config. The base URL is how you actually get around not having to put this full path in every one of those URLs that you saw through those slides. It'll automatically append http://localhost:4200 onto all of those URLs for me, so I don't have to. So this also enables, because it's in a base URL, I can also set this out the command line as an environment variable, and I can run my project against a different URL. Say I'm going from development into staging, into user acceptance, into production. I technically could run my test against all of those different environments without having to change technically any code. I can just set an environment variable, or I can come in and update the base URL here. So I always set my base URL so I don't have to type it all over the place. And if you do have, like Matthew asked, if you had like a third-party API that you needed to call, you could hard set that in. You could also create another variable just for that one. And then there's actually ways you can get access into all these Cypress config files as well. So our next piece that we haven't installed, how do you actually run it? So npx cypress open, that brings up the Cypress UI that you saw earlier. So if let's flip over to that here. So this UI, when it starts up, actually stop our test from running, shows me all of my test files in here. And then from there, if I look on the right side here, I can either run all my specs. Let's kill that because I didn't want to. And I can do it by default, it's in Chrome. They now have it in Firefox, Edge, and Electron. I will warn you that Chrome 83 is super, super flaky for whatever reason. We actually ended up downgrading all of our Chrome stuff in our DevOps, on our DevOps build servers, because as randomly stuff would start failing running from the command line. No clue why. It runs great on the actual desktop. Not so much when you try to automate it through the command line in a headless Chrome environment. That's only an issue with Chrome 83. I've heard it since gone away. And Chrome has had a couple updates over the last month and a half for Chrome 83, so they may have fixed it. But just a warning, if you start seeing some real flakiness when you run it from the command line, that's a Chrome 83 problem. But they now do a bunch of cross-browser support. So earlier we ran it in Chrome. I could pick Edge. It would run it in there. Hopefully Firefox would work. I've actually never tried it in Firefox. None of my projects actually need to be Firefox compatible. I do a lot of internal stuff for a Fortune 50 company. So we're pretty set on Chrome and Edge from a company standpoint, but they do have those enabled. You may be going, well, what about Safari? Because that one is not in there. What about Internet Explorer? Both of those are in their plans, but they're a ways away at this point. Safari, unfortunately, needs some help from Apple, because from what I've been told, every time you try to automate Safari, they put a div that sits on top of your page that says, sorry, you're automating this. We won't allow this to happen because they think someone's hacking your page. So it makes it really difficult for something like Cypress to actually automate your page because you can't get past that div. That requires a fix from Apple. They've been working on that for a bit. Who knows? I do not know where the status of that one is. Same thing for Internet Explorer. It's such a different beast that even though Microsoft is technically not doing any updates to it, there's still a lot of places where Internet Explorer, or at least 11, is still used. A lot of corporations use it, but it takes an awful lot of work to get that automated. And because it's not where the majority of the industry is right now, they chose to do these ones first. At some point in time, they'll get the rest. I can't tell you when that point in time will be, though. And obviously, the Electron at the bottom truly runs in an Electron app. So before we move a little bit beyond the basics, any questions on the basics? Let's look at some beyond then. So what about layout testing? Everything that we have looked at up to this point has all been interacting with the actual DOM, making sure stuff is there. But you notice nothing I've talked about so far said, is my button in the right spot? Is my text box in the right spot? It just said, is it on the page? So at some point you need to do layout testing to truly finish that off. And we've had some funkiness with our layouts. Like at one point in time, Angular used to add your T-bodies onto all of your tables. And so we were using striping based off of that T-body needing to be there, and they would do that automatically. Well, at some point, Angular decided that was a bad practice, which it really was. They shouldn't have probably been patching my HTML code to add things in. And so they stopped doing that. Well, magically, all of our striping went away. For several of our pages, we didn't have layout testing in place. And literally, we actually made it all the way to production before we hit one of the pages where someone went, why does this one look really funky? Thankfully, it was all in the admin areas. And so a very limited set. But if we'd had layout testing where it would go take a screenshot basically of all those pages and compare, does my current screenshot look like my master gold copy of my layout? If not, let's go ahead and flag it. Let's go ahead and stop our automated build from actually running. And the tool that I like to use is Percy for that. Up to this point, all the stuff we've talked about was open source, free to use. Percy is a paid product. You pay them based off the number of snapshots you're actually going to be taking in any given month. And their API is really simple. Cypress has a plugin model. And so Percy wrote a plugin for it. So once you hook up the plugin, cy.percy snapshot, it will give it its own URL or own name for the image, or you can actually give it a name for the image. So let's take a look at this in action. I actually kicked off a Percy run earlier today, so you can at least see what it initially looks like. So you notice it looks very similar to kind of like a GitHub-ish merge request, kind of a URL kind of setup. So when I run my build with Percy hooked up, and every time I call Percy snapshot, it creates this image for me. Does it both? In this case, it did it in Chrome. It also looked at it in Firefox, and it looked at it at 1280 pixels wide, and it looked at it at 375, so mobile view and desktop view. You can configure in Percy. Do you want to turn some of those off? Because if you look for this simple screenshot, right here I have 4 screenshots that were taken. One for Chrome at 375, one for Firefox, one at 1280 for Chrome, one at 1280 for Firefox in here. But I can see here, it's looking, are all these what I want it to actually be? I could request changes. If I go, yeah, that's not what it should look like. In this case, I'm going to actually approve all of them. So once I approve all of them, let's go back and here, I can see I have an approved build. And if I go back to our code base, let's actually make some changes here. I'll throw Actually, let's put it on the actual home page. This way, only one page actually will break. Yeah, right here sounds good. So if I save that, so this bottom little taskbar is my current running Cypress. I'm going to actually stop that because Percy runs from the command line. So if I come back and look at package.json, I have the command in here because I can never actually remember it. So for Percy, I do npx Percy exe, and I tell it I want to do a Cypress run. So I've already hooked up the token to talk to Percy's API so it knows how do I actually connect it together. I've already set up some places that if I go look at cy.percy, actually look at files, cy.percy, you see in my account page, which actually, so since I only put it in this page, go figure the one page I updated isn't going to actually have it. So let's look at login. We're going to actually change the login page because we want it to actually change. So now if I go run npm run Percy, we're going to see here that it's going to kick off our run. Of course, the token didn't get provided. Well, I'm going to go put these on another screen so that I can go grab that token. And then we're going to make this actually work. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, pop them on out so that I can see them. Nothing like not having a actual secrets screen set up. There we go. So now if I do npm run Percy, we will see it kicks us off. Because I set up the Percy token, it knows how to go contact it. And it's going to run through Cypress actually from the command line. And so you get to see how you kind of run it in the DevOps space. And it's going to take screenshots and pass them over to Percy, and it's going to compare the two. So give it a moment to run through this. So you can see here it hit Percy. So these are the places that the snapshots are actually be taken. So you can just see it right in your log file. So here's one of the other cool things that you may be seeing some videos coming through where it says videos starting processing. Those, as you run Cypress from the command line, it actually creates a video of the test running. Because obviously in a DevOps environment, which is what the command line is intended to run from, you don't have access to actually see the UI. It's a headless environment that's kicking off automatically. So when something does fail, you need those videos so you can actually see what was actually going on in the test. So it actually creates all of those videos for you. Now, if I come back to Percy here, you will see that it's already detecting the second build. It's currently processing. I'm at 55 of 60 screenshots. And one of these is going to actually flag here in a moment. So you see right off the bat, it flagged a whole slew of them because something changed on this page. So if I go, you can see I have a hello ColumbusJS that sits right above the email. And it's going, hey, everything got pushed down. It tries to combine the two together so you can see what the heck were the differences. Or if I just click the mouse on it, I can kind of look and visually see what are the differences. Obviously, a whole slew of tests actually failed in here because they're all login page tests. So at this point, I could actually request changes for these. You'll notice there's not really a disapprove button. There's a request changes button. I kind of wish there was a disapprove button, but at least there's a request changes button that did not used to be there. So literally, if I click request changes, I can put in a comment here of and so that whoever needs to go review this can actually go make the changes, rerun the Percy build. And once everything passes, then you will see back here, I will get an actual approved passing build again with no changes. So nice way to do all of my layout testing. You may be wondering how you open or how you hook all this stuff up. So thankfully, they have actually created a really, really good guide that walks you step by step through how to hook this up. I literally was sitting at a conference the first time I used Percy, and I hooked it up in between conference talks and in the 10 minutes between sessions. It's that simple. It's literally an npm install. I'll go into a plugin file, put like 2 lines of code in there, set your token, create your project in Percy, which gives you a token, set your token, and then put that CY Percy snapshot wherever you want it, and you've got Percy wired up for you. Super, super simple to get that wired up. From a pricing standpoint, let's actually look at their pricing, because I don't know their pricing model off the top of my head. So you can get 5,000 screenshots per month for free with unlimited team members. So for a small application, that's going to suffice. For a really, really busy app, like we easily would exceed that for my work app. We run multiple builds a day. Typically, most days we have 20, 30 builds that end up getting kicked off. So we'd easily exceed that. But 5,000 screenshots is still a decent amount to actually get for free every month. So let's see. So Matthew Codd, he says, oh, I saw an A11 thing there. So I might actually just answer his question. Let's look at one other question in here. I can't find it in the docs, but does Percy support assertions on accessibility? We're going to actually absolutely cover that in a moment. And I see Doug asked about testing custom components. So Doug, you want to unmute and give me a little more detail on custom components and what you're looking for?
Web components, custom elements. I mean, I presume you could test that they exist and their attributes the same as usual. Can you look inside them?
I've not tried it, but typically the stance I've always asked is if you can get access to it through the DOM, then yes.
Well, Shadow DOM, I think, yeah, actually, I'm not sure. I haven't gone too deep into how what the Shadow DOM looks like.
So I will point later on to a spot where you can actually see some recipes in the documentation, and they may have a recipe that already shows you how to actually do that work. Cypress is really good with their docs, but their API is super well documented. They have a lot of different recipes that they've done for various typical things that you may be doing in your application that you need to test. They even have a real world application that they recently released that shows how do you do like database seeding all the way through end-to-end testing, kind of a deal. So we'll actually kind of go through all of that in a bit. And maybe we'll find something for the web component piece in there. And Doug, I see that Matthew put a comment into the Zoom chat about a Cypress issue that may actually be related to your web component question.
Experimental Shadow DOM support. Okay.
There you go. So accessibility testing. So this is an important thing to actually have. It's one of the pieces where we tend to forget about accessibility testing. And shockingly enough, in the world, 1 in 5 people actually have some disability, even if you can't see it. So a huge amount of people, 20% of the population has some disability that's being left out of your website if you're not making it compatible for the accessibility. Now, I will say as well, you cannot fully automate accessibility testing. It's always going to be impossible, at least with the technologies we have today. What you can automate, and the stuff we're going to talk about, is the semantic side of it. Do I actually have the right tags on there? Do I have the right color contrast? Things that a machine can actually test. What we can't automatically test is if I put an ARIA tag on there that describes an element, does that description make sense at all? Does it truly describe what is going on? That's the piece that just by default, you can't actually automate those pieces. You'd have to do a lot more true AI work to get that there. But what we can do, all that semantic stuff. And there's a product called Axe Core. It's actually an open source product. And thankfully enough, they wrote a Cypress plugin, or somebody wrote a Cypress plugin for Axe Core. And it goes through a slew of rules looking at all the accessibility standards and will flag them if you don't match them. And it's literally as easy as visit a page, inject Axe Core onto the page. So you don't have to leave all of the Axe JavaScript onto your page and put it into production. You can literally inject it as part of your test. And then you tell it, check the A11Y. So every single time I make a change on the page, I can call that check A11Y again to make sure that I still pass the accessibility test. If I pop up a new dialog, I type something in and a validation rule fires, I can go and check, did this accessibility actually pass or not? So let's take a look at what does this look like when something actually fails. So I'm going to go turn on a couple places. So first I'm going to put in my inject Axe Core. You'll notice I have a before each up here, like every testing framework. So this one sits on, Cypress actually sits on top of Jasmine ultimately. So you get before each, run this before each one of the test runs. I get a before all. I technically get an after each and an after all. It is an anti-practice in the Cypress world to actually use the after pieces. Their feeling is you should set your test to have what it needs in the befores, not try to capture stuff in the after and reset it. That's what the before is actually for. So let's turn back on the check A11Y. I'm also going to go over here to the app component and uncomment a couple lines of code here. And npx Cypress open, because we wanted to open the UI back up again. And the key to making this work as well, you need to have your actual web server running. So that's what this, let me go back here. That's what is running in this other command window or other terminal inside of VS Code. Because it's an Angular project, it's running ngserve. Because Cypress doesn't serve up your web page itself. It expects you to have a web server. It doesn't have any guidance around which one you should use. That's totally up to you. You just have to start it up so that Cypress can actually access it. So in this UI, if I don't want to run all the specs, I can actually click on the file itself, and it's going to run just the 404 file for me. And we're going to see it's actually going to fail with some A11Y. So it's going to tell me I have an ARIA hidden focus on one node. I've got a duplication main, and I don't have a unique node. Throws a little bit of the error. The stack trace, not super valuable in this case. What is valuable is if I open up the Chrome DevTools and I click on one of these accessibility warnings, it actually gives me a little bit of detail, and it gives me a link to go over to the Axe Core documentation to tell me what the heck was this error actually about, and gives me some example code and tells me why it matters, how to fix it. So, because in most cases, we don't know that we actually have this issue going on. Funny enough, the test that looks like I did a contrived test, I actually had that real error when I hooked up Axe Core the first time and didn't even know I had it there. I'd been doing the workshop for over a year and had never run through accessibility testing until I ran into this Axe Core product. And I went, oh, I actually have a couple errors. Funny enough, I can't fix the top error. I can't figure out where it's broken. It just showed up magically with one of the Angular updates. But because I have these, I at least know, okay, I have these errors. I know how to fix them. So if I actually go back to our code here, let's get rid of and go down to one main tag, which actually should be that section, not the big Jumbotron title. So we'll see I also have auto reload able. So once the Angular UI kicks off, or it should, let's actually make sure it rebuilt itself or not. Normally the reload actually triggers Cypress to actually run as well. So notice I actually got rid of that one error and I'm down to 2. So I can keep doing all these updates in Axe Core until I get down to 0. to hook up AxeCore, literally it's another document. Same conference that I was at for Percy, in between another session, I actually went through this documentation. It's literally npm install the actual plugin, go into the plugin file and wire it up. If I go pull up our plugins file, so one of the things I didn't cover earlier that I should have is where does Cypress actually reside your code? So very, very first time you run Cypress open, it goes and creates the Cypress directory, creates you fixtures, which is a spot that you can actually put all of your mocks. So you see, I have one example here. This is a nice way, instead of polluting your code with a whole bunch of mocks, especially in the environment I'm in at the Fortune 50 company. We have some of our objects, they're 40, 50 lines of code. Last thing I want to do is pollute my test with having 4 or 5 of those things and have 400 lines of test code that's nothing but mocks. When instead, I literally can drop this file in here. If I go find one of my mocks, I'll just go do it since I opened that loop up. Let's go and actually update one of our integration tests. So inside integration is where your actual tests are. And we're going to shrink down that. And let's find one of our actual mocks here, cy.route. So if I were to actually move this response output, I could actually move that. And then I could say fixture : example.json, and that would go away. And now Cypress is going to magically, when it sees this, go, oh, I need to go in the fixture folder and I need to pull out example.json, and that's what my response is going to be. Way nicer than having lots of code. 4 lines of code, not bad. 40 lines of code gets old really quickly as you're tracing through test.
Is that fixture singular on purpose? Because that didn't match the directory structure, or should it match the directory structure?
It is fixture singular on purpose because you're pulling out a single file. So if you kind of think of fixtures with the S as the group of all the possible fixtures, fixture singular is that one single file that you need for that one response that you mocked out. So the plugins is the place where you actually wire up all your plugins. So you'll see here, I've wired up the Percy health check. So literally this is in the Percy documentation. So say require @Percy, and then they give you this little bit of code to say for the task, make Percy health check, which is how this actually gets wired in. So I can call cy.Percy snapshot and it knows how the heck to actually find it. In our support directory, this is where you can actually do custom commands. So you could actually extend the Cypress command. So if you had a whole bunch of code, like login code is a great example. If you need to mock that out in every single one of the files, somewhere you want to have that be a reusable bit of code. You can actually create a command. So you say Cypress command add. So if I were to uncomment this and it actually worked, which obviously it's got 3 dots, so it's not real code. But because I gave it this name drag, now anywhere I want to use it, I could say cy.drag, and automatically Cypress takes all the custom commands and makes them available as it runs through stuff. So nice way to extend out. We've got tons of custom commands that we've written in our production applications. Login stuff, common things that we look at, like for all the grids that I've talked about, where we look at the number of records and the sorting, A to Z and Z to A, all of that stuff, literally the only thing that changed between the code was what was our actual selectors. And so that made great little helpers to make custom commands for that. So I've literally passed into the custom command, what is the selector I need to go run? And then it'll validate and the number of records. And it'll validate, did my record count match? Does the A to Z sorting work? And now I have one call to cy.table sort validation. And off I'm going instead of 20 lines of code to actually do it. And the videos directory doesn't get created initially. That got created because I ran the Percy, so executable, which ran Cypress run from the command line. If I pull up or attempt to pull up one of these, you see as it runs through this, it literally looks exactly like what we saw in the actual UI itself. Because it's such a fast test, if I actually pause through this, Yeah, it ran super, super fast. And actually, that was a bad file because it doesn't actually have anything on that page. Let's look at the account one. Way better file. So you can actually see what it's actually doing there. It's going fast enough that it's probably hard to see over Zoom, but locally off my build server, I can go download that MP4 file. I can slowly trace through it, see what exactly was that error. Sometimes you get errors and you're like, I have absolutely no clue what caused that. And then you see the video back and you go, oh, somehow some element didn't get covered or it didn't go to the next element. I forgot something in there that and normally your test will pass locally and they'll magically fail on the build server for something funky. A lot of times when you equate that to flakiness, you go, well, it worked on the locally, it doesn't work on the build server. The number one reason for that is your machine typically runs way slower than your build server runs. You have other applications running on your machine. You have other things going on that may be taking resources in there. It's trying to paint the whole screen. But when you run it on a build server, it's running in a headless environment, so it's not actually trying to do any of that painting of the screen. Typically, you have minimal amount of apps running on there, so stuff runs a lot quicker, which sometimes causes things to actually fail in the build server because you didn't handle something like that debounce time that I mentioned earlier, or if you had told it, wait for half a second or a second before you go run the API call, well, after I'm done typing, well, on a locally, you may just magically, it may take that long for it to actually work. On the build server, it may only take a half a second. And so it goes, hey, I didn't get the data I wanted. That meant you didn't handle something. So that's typically what happens in those cases. So back to, I don't think there's actually anything in this custom command. Yeah, I didn't have to wire up anything in this custom command for axe core to actually work. It looks like it just, oh, I knew there was something. So in the support file, you did have to import Cypress or Percy, and you had to import axe core. Both of those are in the documentation that I mentioned. So questions before we talk about DevOps. So because we're running a little long on our presentation, instead of truly covering DevOps in depth, where I'm going to point you is two places. For the Angular, I actually wrote a whole article that's step-by-step on Medium for the NGConf conference. It's about 1.5 years ago. All of those steps are still valid. And literally, even if you're not in the Angular space, the stuff that you need to actually do, still in many cases is actually valid of how you set all that stuff up. I also did a whole webcast with the Cypress team. We covered Team City, Circle CI, and I know there's one more, or in Travis CI. So those 3 environments, we covered how you actually set those up and run through all of those. In the demo app that I've been showing, it does have everything wired up. If I go look at the package JSON, you will see here there is a bunch of CI commands that are actually wired up. So I have the full CI here, which says I actually like to use something called run or npm run all is the actual package. It allows me to run npm commands either in serial, so one after the other, or in parallel at the same time. Even though in the Angular space, I could run my linting, I could run my unit test, and I could run my build all at the same time, I actually run them serially for the log file. When you run them parallel, we use Team City, and there's nothing in there that separates the two. So you just get this jumbled mess of a log file going, I'm 10% into my build at the same time as trying to show you linting. And so I just run them serial one after the other. They only take an extra maybe minute to run. So I'm like, for an extra minute to get a log file I can actually view when something fails, I'm going to run them in a serial mode. Then I tell it actually go and run CY-run, which kicks off. There's an NPM package called start server and test. One of the things you have to make sure of when you get in the DevOps space, you don't want to leave your server running. You want to get in there, start up the server, run your test, kill the server afterwards. That's exactly what start server and test does for us. So you tell it, I want to go start up the server here. So it's going to actually run this command, which runs Angular HTTP server, goes and looks at my build path and starts it on port 4200 for me. Then it comes back up here to our CY run And it says, go look at localhost 4200, wait for me to actually respond. Once it gets an actual valid response that's up and running, then it's going to go kick off my CY run, which is the same thing that you saw Percy run without the Percy side of it. Runs everything from the command line. Once that exits, whether it's successful or not successful, start server and test will then kill the Angular HTTP server so I don't leave any artifacts running on the server itself. And so both the article and the webcast run through how do you actually set all of that stuff up, all the things you need to install, all the packages, all that funness. And I'm going to briefly, very briefly, talk about the real world application that the Cypress team actually recently released. So they have this app, if I bring up the right browser. So they wrote a React application that essentially allows you to send money to people, and you can see your balance transactions to people. Let's see if I can actually. So it's got a whole bunch of like forms in here. It's got bank accounts, notifications. It's essentially a full application. And they go soup to nuts testing. So they go API testing, they seed a database just like you would if you were going to do end-to-end testing. You need to put some bit of data into your database, run your test, go and clean up your database afterwards, and you keep rinsing and repeating that process. So they actually have it as a whole GitHub, a package that you can download. You can get all the code for it. In here, you can literally dig through how the heck do they actually set up all of these pieces? How do they set up their database seeding? Looking through. So you can see here in Cypress, they've got tons and tons of stuff. I mentioned custom commands earlier. They have a ton of custom commands in here. So login by API, React components. So I can just say cy.react component, cy.login by API. So if you're interested in Cypress and how it did all of that real world testing, definitely go check out this GitHub URL. And you can literally spend hours looking through all of their best practices. It's actually written by the Cypress team, so it follows all of their best practices in the way that they would actually do testing. So it's a fantastic little free app to actually use, and they're keep enhancing it. So I saw a pull request that they're actually working on adding both Percy in there, as well as they have a couple other plugins for doing snapshot testing. And so they're going to keep enhancing that. So great way to actually get going with that. So you might still be asking, well, what might stop you? All this stuff sounds amazing, but are there places that we're blind to that may stop you from actually implementing it at your work? The answer is there is a couple spots potentially, not always related to Cypress. We'll cover that here in just a sec. The first thing is it works only in Chromium-based browsers, Firefox, and Electron. So if you are heavy in Internet Explorer, if you are heavy in Safari, and you have a major use case where you need to do that, Cypress may fall apart at that point for you because it doesn't work in those other browsers. You may end up with like a Selenium WebDriver or another product. But realistically, Chrome, if it works in Chrome, at least 80% plus of your functionality will typically work in Internet Explorer, will typically work in Safari, as long as you followed that whole, will it work or not? And I forget the exact URL. There's a whole website that will tell you what functionality will work in each one of the browsers. As long as you follow that and you made sure you didn't create something that is only in the most modern browser and won't work in Internet Explorer, then you're good to go. So at least 80% of your functionality is covered. I would rather have 80% of my functionality covered and have to still manually test 20% than to have to manually test 100%. It's worth the investment for that 80%. The bigger piece, though, is it takes time to change the culture. If you're not already in a testing culture where you include testing as part of your definition of done, that was one of the big changes we had to make as we started doing more of this automated testing. We had to make sure that as a group, our definition of done included all of our testing scenarios. We couldn't just say, put it in there every single time. You have to make sure to test, because we did that for a while. And it just has to become the way that you actually work. Management has to back it as well. If management is constantly going, how come it's taking you so long to get stuff out? And you're like, it's because I'm doing the testing, we're ensuring quality. And they go, I need you to go faster. I need you to go faster. That's a quality and a culture change that you have to actually make that shift. It has to be bought in from the top all the way down. It's really tough to try to get it bought in at the bottom and push it up, because they start to see it's going to take you 1.5 to 2x in order to do the testing. Even once you get good at it, it's still going to be about 1.5x the amount of effort in order to create the same functionality with testing in there. It's additional code you have to support. The very first time that we implemented Cypress in one of our sprints, it took us about 4 to 5x the amount of time to actually do the testing. And funny enough, the guy that's my main UI developer, the Fortune 50 company, we've been in the same groups. We're like on group number 7 together, obviously like working together. Over about 19 years, we've been in the same groups. Through that whole time until about a year ago when I implemented Cypress, I always kept going, we should really automate some of the testing. And he kept going, yeah, it's way too difficult. I just want to get functionality out to customers and make the difference. Or, oh, we should at least document it. He's like, no, I don't want to document it really either. That takes a lot of time. And he literally got done with Cypress and went back to the team and went, holy heck, this is fantastic. And he actually started writing tests without me having to push him. That first sprint was a constant, hey, did you actually automate this test? Did you think about this? To now when I see stuff coming in, it has all the test scenarios in there. He's pushing everyone else on the team as they do UI work to actually include the test in there. And he's actually excited about doing UI testing. Literally first time in 19 years I've ever seen him excited ever about testing. Like he is definitely 100% I want to get functionality out to the customers and make a difference. For him to actually take time to say, I'm going to spend that time to do testing because I see the value and I see how easy it is and how much it makes a difference in my coding and in my actual work environment. It took time to change that culture. It took time to get management to just go, yes, testing is important. And so you have to have that buy-in from the top down. It also takes time to get good at writing tests, just like it takes time to get good at writing code. Your first set of code probably isn't going to look anywhere near as polished as your code that you write today. If you look back 6 months from now, you're going to learn all kinds of stuff and go, man, that code was not great. You're going to look back at your testing code and do the same thing. You're going to learn new things are going to come out. So it takes time to get good at that. It takes time to get down to the 1.5 time effort instead of the 2 or 3 times effort. But it's worth the investment ultimately because you make up for it in the reduction of actual manual testing time. When we actually started implementing all this, we literally had 3 to 4 days at the end of every one of our 3-week sprints. That was a code freeze. And then our QA, 2 QAs we had would literally spend the next 4 days manually testing. We're now to the point that we literally code all the way through our sprints because we've automated so much of the work that our QA folks can actually keep up with our code. They know we have some regression tests in there. They know their manual test. It doesn't take long. We're at 56% in our API, or 57% in our API for code coverage. In our UI, right now we're at about 37 to 40%, depending on how much code they've added this week and haven't tested yet. Because we still have times where test code doesn't come in MVPs, but it comes in before that MVP goes to prod. But having 40% of our major functionality covered allowed our QA folks to then go off and actually focus on the true critical stuff that they want to do. Looking at things like, does your text boxes work with foreign characters? Does it work with all the special characters? What if I take the Hamlet text? There is a spot where you can get the whole Hamlet text, all 135,000 characters of it with no line breaks in there. So they'll type that in or paste that in a lot of times to our text boxes to see, did we actually restrict down that length? Or did we let that go all the way to the API and then it overflowed potentially into a memory error? It allowed them to go and do a lot of those other testing instead of just worrying about, did I actually click the button and the right thing popped up on the screen? Like we can automate all that so they can go do what QA does best, try to break the system. But it takes you time to get there. And the biggest advice is don't take an all or nothing approach. I've seen teams try to go, we're going to dedicate the next 6 weeks to do it, catching up on all of our test code and writing all this. Well, then they don't finish it all. And then the decision comes, well, do we keep going with it? Do we not? It goes back to the culture. Do it as you go. Every time you make code changes, go ahead and write the test first for it. Make sure you validate the existing code works, and then go and make your changes. Build up your test over time. Call all of your existing code legacy code. Basically, that means it truly works, or at least you assume it works unless your customers have told you otherwise. That way you can build it up over time, because there's not a single, and I can guarantee there's not a single company out there that's going to let you go, let's just take the next 6 months and not deliver you any functionality, and let's just write test cases for what we already have. Like, there's nobody out there that's going to allow you to do that, because they need to keep the business running. But what you can do is start adding those tests in. And so over time, we didn't start with, right now we have 450, almost 500 tests in our UI and almost 1,000 in our API. We didn't start there. That built up literally over time. 35 tests the first sprint, 100 the next sprint. And it just builds over time as you go do that. So don't take the all or nothing. Build it up slowly and build it up as you make changes to your existing code base or you add in new code. So if you want to connect with me after the presentation, there's a whole bunch of places. DigitalDrummerJ.me is my website and my blog. I'm on Twitter at DigitalDrummerJ. I supposedly stream every so often on Twitch, not nearly as much as Guy does, as he kind of puts me to shame because I don't stream as nearly as often as I say I want to. And then my company site, letyournerdbeheard.com. Again, we build up your authority, influence, and income on YouTube. And I'll open it up to questions, anything that you have.
Does Cypress, is there any tips for working with, say, a WebSocket connection or mocking WebSockets such as like SignalR?
That is a great question. And I promised you one more thing, which was to actually go look at their docs. And so I'm going to actually look that one up here. So cypress.io, once you're at their website, they have this nice docs link and WebSockets. So they do have some stuff in here for WebSockets. Let's see what their general question is. So it looks like they have an answer somewhere in here for WebSockets. Would have been nice if it would have taken me to it, but it did not. Short answer, yes. So, and I have seen some stuff in the mocking for the WebSockets. I've just never personally used it. And we also wanted to look up web components.
I have another web word I want to look up too.
What would that one be?
WebAssembly.
I thought you were going to say that.
Yeah.
So it doesn't come up necessarily in their docs. Let me go back and look at their guides here. And
my guess would be it would just be transparent. They wouldn't, you know, the browser's going to handle it. It's just going to be behind the UI.
That would be my guess as well. So of course, I'm not finding the exact page that I wanted because I put myself on the spot and said I would show it. Recipes. There we go. So on the recipe page, they have a slew of things that they've actually looked at here. So potentially they have some additional stuff. As I mentioned earlier, the Cypress team's super open. They're really responsive on Twitter. If you have any questions about does it do this, does it do that, and you can't find the answer with just a quick Google search, just tag them in a tweet, and they will get back to you. They're super responsive for that stuff.
Can you test a pure JavaScript function within Cypress, or do you need to run a separate testing framework for that?
So more of like a unit test kind of a deal?
Yeah.
So I have seen some proof of concepts from them using, I want to say it's just, I believe that's the React unit testing framework. I'm not a React developer, as you can tell, but I've seen some stuff where they've talked about that. I've seen some places where they've done some demos of other unit testing frameworks. So the short answer is, yes, it is possible. It is not the primary focus of their tool, but I definitely have seen them pushing a bit into that space as well so they can kind of become the all-encompassing testing tool.
Yeah, I'm just thinking sometimes you might want to test some ancillary thing without going through the DOM.
Yep,
Logically,
absolutely.
the other DOM tests.
Yep. And that's why I still had that 10% on the testing pyramid for unit testing, because there are times where a pure JavaScript function makes absolute sense to still unit test, because you don't need a UI to test a pure JavaScript function. I don't need React or Angular or Vue or anything spun up to do that. So it makes perfect sense to use, whether it's a Jest, whether it's a Jasmine, a Karma, or any of those pieces. Any other questions?
There's a thank you for this excellent presentation on Twitch. I just wanted to point that out. So
Thank you back to you for attending.
Yeah, I think that's Matthew actually on Twitch as well, is it? No, it's not. But it's well, thank you then, MB Dunson. Yeah, he did a great job, didn't he? So is this the part where we applause? I think this is the part where we applaud. So yeah, there we go. Fantastic job. So I haven't actually used Cypress myself, and it's something that I've been meaning to look at. And so this allowed me to both schedule someone for my meetup and check an item off my to-do list.
There you go. Yeah, and Cypress was one of those funky things where I just tried it out and went, if everyone else is recommending, because I've seen a bunch of people I followed in industry all of a sudden picked it up, and I went, well, let me try it out. And it literally was the first time I've ever picked up a testing core. I went, I actually want to do testing. And funny enough, even though I'm one of our senior architects, I actually started leading our test team this year.
Oh, wow.
Because I picked up just a passion for, let's make this actually work. Let's really put this as part of our culture. And so I'm driving a lot of that stuff because it makes it so easy to actually do it.
I like how it's running in pure JavaScript when you're testing an Angular app, because you're running directly in the browser, so you don't need to transpile and worry about things. And I have some nasty protractor tests that have to go open a new browser window, go check Mailhog, get the email with the one-time login URL, grab the URL, search the text of the email, grab the URL from it, return it, all in this promise chain that's started by a browser.execute, if you're familiar with protractor. Then it returns as a problem, which is, it works and all that, but it's probably a little easier.
Yeah, sounds horrible to maintain, but yes, it does work.
That'd be one of my custom commands in Cypress if I had it.
Exactly. So, Guy, thank you for having me out to ColumbusJS.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for speaking. It's great to have good speakers, and even though the pandemic has made it harder for us to all meet in person, it's actually made it a lot easier to schedule speakers for meetups, because people can come from all over the globe and give a talk. So I appreciate it very much. Would have loved to have you actually flown here in person, but that probably would have been less likely to happen.
Would have been less likely to happen these days.
So, but yeah, again, thanks a lot. So
Thank you.
we're going to hang out here until everyone's tired of hanging out. We're going to end the Twitch stream here in just a moment, but I did want to point out, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I can here. I should probably make sure there's nothing on it that I don't want anyone to see, like my calendar. But just to show you what we got, who we got coming up. We go right there. Share. There, you should be seeing Firefox now. Is everyone seeing Firefox? Yes, we're seeing Firefox. So this is the talk we just did tonight. Next month on August 19th, we have Ryan Lancio. He's based out of, I think he's in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he's going to be talking about how you might not need Webpack. And he's going to talk about a Snowpack. So that should be quite cool. And we're going to be actually doing a collaboration event on that particular one. There's up near Ann Arbor, there's a more of a general software craftsman meetup that's wanting to do a collaboration. And so Ryan's up there already. It seemed like a good fit. So we're assuming Ryan's okay with it. I haven't asked him yet. We'll be streaming both on Canton Coders and on ColumbusJS. And we'll try and have the Zoom all integrated. So we might have a lot of new faces here next month. So that's next month. And then in and as it turns out, actually in September, we have another Cypress talk. So if you can't get enough of this, then Jordan Powell is going to be giving a talk on automated testing, all the things with Cypress. So
I'll have to tell Jordan, do more of an advanced talk.
Yeah. And a fun fact, actually, Jordan lives in the same city that my mother does, in the same small town in Ohio. Which I'm not going to say who it is, who that is, where that is on Twitch, but I just think it's kind of funny. So, but anyhow, yeah. So that's what we got coming up. We have talks scheduled after this, but I don't have the website updated and I can't get to them easily. So, but yeah, that's what we have coming up. And that's pretty much it. Do you have anything? Anyone have any last minute questions or any announcements they want to make for upcoming events, or just something cool that they would like to share with all the people on Twitch and YouTube before we sign off? I'm going to take that as a no. So, okay, well, thank you very much for watching on Twitch. We're going to hang out here on Zoom a bit later. If you're on Twitch, the links to the Zoom are in there. So if you want to join us, feel free. Thanks a lot.